could do a lot more if I had people who, wanted to read the history of sociology with me and really wanted to think about it in relation to Marxism, like in a in-depth way, right?
All right. Welcome to the Spencer Leonard Hour. With me, as always, for this podcast is Spencer Leonard, one of the founding members of the Platypus Affiliated Society, historian, professor, curmudgeon. Spencer, welcome back to your own podcast.
Thanks, Doug. Good to be back.
So we're going to be talking about C. Wright Mills today. I took the time to review the beginning of Sociological Imagination, read the letter to the New Left, and I read a debate between Browder and Shatman as well. So
It's a blast from the past, isn't it?
Yeah. And yeah, it's a blast from two pasts, the blast from the actual time of Mills, but also is a blast from the past of the millennial left. I mean, there was a moment where re-examining the New Left, going over these kinds of questions again, seemed relevant to a group of young people who were trying to establish perhaps a socialist party, certainly a new form of socialism. And so it was, I hadn't read the new letter to the New Left in probably maybe a decade. I'm not sure, but it had been a while since I'd looked at it, and it was worthwhile to look at it again. But what I want to start with is just to get you to tell me how I should think about C. Wright Mills. Who was he? What did he represent?
Yeah, there are a couple of different things that, we started off by I suggested that maybe we talk about sociology. You suggested that we do Mills, which I think is a good idea. Obviously, C. Wright Mills is a prominent figure. He's a bridge figure between the old left and the new left. He's too young to have been, truly engaged with the 30s left, but that's the only left he really knew. He's truly a figure of the post-war period, from 1945 until his death, which I believe was in 1962. And for those people who don't know, he's a great inspiration to the new left. In really the mainstream of the new left in the United States. So figures like Tom Hayden, who wrote the Port Huron Statement, was writing his master's thesis on C. Wright Mills at the time. I think he was living with another prominent new left intellectual who's a little bit older, Stanley Aronowitz, who taught a whole generation, Marx, put together the most important single collection of Max Horkheimer, etc. Died recently, founder of the Left Forum in New York City. Todd Gitlin, the list just goes on and on in terms of people who were inspired by him if they weren't actually his students. He taught at Columbia University, and he really captures, first of all, the importance of sociology in that period. Sociology would have been, the subject that New Left kids would have studied, to a very large degree. It's a kind of a forgotten discipline now, and it's really stuck in that period. It's amusing to me. I mean, I teach sociology, though I'm not a proper sociologist. We'd have to get Ashley on here to get a real sociologist. But I teach an intro to sociology, and all the textbooks start with C. Wright Mills. All the textbooks are written by people who were inspired by C. Wright Mills, and they all talk about the sociological imagination at the beginning. That's we're all supposed to have that. Are you there, Doug? You look frozen.
Yeah, no, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm here.
Okay, yeah. So on the one hand, he represents, the importance of the social sciences in the post-war American university. He also, he represents the social sciences as, this is what the sociological imagination is about. Basically as a successor to Marxism. He's a leftist sociologist and self-conscious post-Marxist, and that's central to the new left self-understanding. Is that he's influenced by people like Max Shachtman, who's part of that debate that you read. And people like Dwight McDonald. Dwight McDonald and Max Shachtman themselves break, but they're both on the Shachtman side of the original split within American Trotskyism between Shachtman and James Cannon, and they basically represent third camp leftism. Neither Washington nor Moscow. Shachtman has a kind of bureaucratic collectivist understanding of what the Soviet Union is. It's not in any sense a project of human liberation, and so Mills represents a kind of exhaustion. He thinks of Marxism as what the Eastern Bloc says it is, to a large degree, especially if he's speaking as a post-Marxist. He also thinks that liberalism is what America says it is, or in some sense, again, in as much as he's living in a fraught time that he understands to be sort of post-liberal. So at the same time, as I say all of that, he's a liberal and he's a Marxian. Right? He is very liberal. He's explicitly inspired by the German liberal Max Weber, whom he translates, and professors still use his translation of Weber as the sort of single volume introduction to Max Weber that he did with a German named Hans Gerth from Max Weber. But it's more than that he translated it. It's clear that he thinks of sociology as stemming from Weber, and Weber is the sociologist who's in deepest dialogue with Marx and Marxism. He's, and of course, Weber is an anti-Marxist, but he is very intensely engaged, and of course, he's close friends with Georg Lukács, who breaks with him to become, the great philosopher of Marxism that he is from 1917 to 1924.
Can I interject and ask you a question there about that in particular? What was it that motivated Lukács to break and to move towards Marxism, break away from Weber?
Lukács would have had a view that, not entirely unlike Mills, he would have had the view that, Marxism is a bit passé, before he becomes a Marxist as a young intellectual in Hungary. He's a Hungarian Jew, writes some important books as a before he becomes a Marxist, Soul and Form. Is it The Theory of the Novel? I get confused sometimes, but classic work on,
yeah, I think it was The Theory of the Novel.
There's another one that he writes as a Stalinist that I get confused. about the novel form. And it's really the Bolshevik Revolution that's crucial for Lukács. You could view Lukács and Weber as, so you could call them proto-existentialists. They're kind of high modernists. You could view them that way. Certainly Weber, is a very kind of fraught, lonely intellectual, a kind of intellectual who is quite melancholy about the fate of the modern world. Famously expressed in his image of the iron cage at the end of the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Lukács would have shared those attitudes, and he's, and the Bolshevik Revolution, really transforms Lukács. He's like, oh, actually, these Marxists are addressing the fundamental problems of our time. Right? So it is the Bolshevik Revolution for him, and he undertakes a substantial study of Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. Doubtless Trotsky too, but he doesn't talk about Trotsky. Trotsky's controversial, when he's writing. There's already the so-called literary dispute in 1924. But mainly Lenin and Luxemburg as the great intellectuals of the revisionist dispute and the great revolutionaries of 1917-18. And on the basis of that study, recovers the marks of Marxism. And so when you read History and Class Consciousness, which is his most important book, though there are others from his period, his sort of pre-Stalinist dialectical period, like Taylism and the Dialectic, which is a defense of history and class consciousness, and then a short little book on Lenin. But mainly he quotes Marx, right? He even quotes the Marx of Das Kapital more than he does, the writings of Marx that Lenin and Luxemburg would have more commonly quoted, which would have been political writings, like the 18th Brumaire, the Civil War in France, the kind of things that Lenin talks about in State and Revolution. And so Lukács is, he's recovering Marx in the fullness of his negative dialectical madness. He's the great thinker. Lukács is the great thinker of what Adorno calls negative dialectics. When Adorno coins that or uses that phrase, I don't think he's claiming originality. Ultimately, negative dialectics is in Marxism itself. It's not, with Lukács, but Lukács grasps Marx and Marxism, as it were, philosophically, which is a tricky business, right? It's in a sense, to treat Marxism philosophically is already a kind of indication of Marxism's perhaps terminal crisis. Lenin and Luxemburg are negative dialecticians as politicians, as figures of world history, and of course as theorists of mass political parties for socialism. Lukács is like Karl Korsch, who he gets criticized with, and his name is inevitably associated with, because they're both criticized by the Comintern, I believe by Zinoviev. They're both famous for recovering the dialectical, the philosophical dimension of Marxism, right? And, kind of picking up on, especially someone like Rosa Luxemburg, will say crazy things like, Edward Bernstein is a Kantian, or Edward Bernstein, his problem is that he's non-dialectical, right? She'll just have these like throwaway remarks, or Leon Trotsky will give you a whole chapter on like the rise of the czarist state as a part of the concept of Europe, and what its political economy looks like, and then he'll say, and that's just Adam Smith. Revolution is the meaning of all the law and the prophets, right? You just have these crazy throwaway comments amongst these Second International Marxists. They're not writing philosophy, and in fact, when they do address philosophy, like when in Lenin, when he addresses, what is it called? Imperio-criticism, right? It's okay, it's okay. Like there are bits in like Lenin's notebooks on Hegel that are interesting, but they're not philosophers, but they understand that socialism, making the revolution, is the meaning of philosophy, right? It's right. In other words, philosophy means the struggle for freedom in history, right? And so people like Lukács and Korsch are recognizing that stripping that away is also the stripping it away in revisionist Marxism, is the stripping away of the project of freedom in the sense of the goal of socialism. Right. So Edward Bernstein very famously says, the movement of is everything, the goal is nothing.
Okay,
right?
So I want to interject here and say this is a good point to transition back to C. Wright Mills, because I believe that he is making a similar claim to Lukács in terms of the need for the need of theory, he would say it, or philosophy, and the need for a utopian sociological imagination to return. In other words, precisely for the need to return to sociology, maybe as a project of freedom and change, rather than merely positivist descriptive techniques after the end of ideology. And one question I had for you written down was would you think it would be fair to say that Mills found the same end of ideology in the Soviet Union and in the USA at the time of when he was writing the letter to the New Left, that he was critiquing both liberalism and Marxism for their lack of maybe a philosophical imagination?
Yeah, he goes to the Eastern Bloc. I don't know everywhere he goes. I know he goes to Poland. He meets people like Leszek Kolakowski, but others. And he talks about meeting some, basically party apparatchiks in the East. And he'll be like, "Yeah, this is just like talking to my colleagues in the sociology department at Columbia."
Right.
This is the equivalent of Daniel Bell in the Eastern Bloc.
Yeah, only they're less gossipy and a little bit less like Mean Girls, maybe. But yeah.
Yeah. So, he makes these kind of comments, which is, obviously, he was much despised amongst his colleagues at Columbia and really in the entire field of social science. I mean, what I would say, Doug, is that, he is calling, of course, for a new leftist intellectualism. I mean, he's certainly doing that. But what he thinks, I guess if I could, I'd put it this way. I guess I could say my favorite sociologist is a guy named Emil Durkheim. And it's because Durkheim, he knows, on the one hand, he's founding the discipline of sociology. But on the other hand, he knows that sociology itself is a kind of symptom of a crisis. Right. So the person who coins the word that, certainly Durkheim would have been very aware of was the so-called founder of positivism, Auguste Comte, who is roughly a contemporary of Marx and Engels. Really, I believe he's older than Marx and Engels, but he writes, around the Revolution of 1848. And calls for sociology, as really as a kind of technocratic enterprise, right? As an elite technocratic enterprise. And Durkheim realizes that, really this is, Comte and subsequent sociology are a symptom of the crisis of bourgeois thought. So he's thinking a lot about what's my relationship to, the people he talks about would be Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Adam Smith, Immanuel Kant, right? Where do we stand in relationship to the Enlightenment? And where do we stand, of course, in relationship to the French Revolution? And how is the time of sociology, he's talking about the 1890s, really the time of the crisis of Marxism, the era of the revisionist dispute. How is our time expressive of a crisis of liberalism, or in a sense, our inability to inherit it? Someone like Mills, is not like that. Right? He thinks that the great figures really of 20th century sociology, people like Max Weber and Karl Mannheim, also the American, I believe he's Danish-American, Thorstein Veblen, that these people are really prophets of a new approach to intellectual life, right? That the old liberalism and the old socialism are dead, and sociology points forward. It's quite like tortured in Mills. So if there's a chapter in, this is the sociological imagination, that we're discussing. Chapter 9 of that book, the penultimate chapter, is called Reason and Freedom. And what he says is, in effect, reason and freedom come from, in other words, these categories of the Enlightenment. They come from the overcoming of feudalism, right? So that's his way of calling them bourgeois. Right? These are categories that come from the revolt of the Third Estate, and they're exhausted now. And yet, the whole end of the book is a call to a kind of re-engagement with reason and freedom. Right. And so on the one hand, he's diagnosing their crisis. And what that looks like is a Weberian analysis of rationalization. Right. Things are getting more organizationally, things are rationalized. Right. Like the way that we make things, the way that, bureaucracy would be a classic example of things becoming more rational organizationally. Sociology itself is a kind of rationalization of social inquiry. And yet that rationalization not only isn't substantively rational, in other words, it can just be a rational pursuit of what what the Enlightenment would view as irrational ends. He thinks that you can't really adjudicate goals, right, or values rationally. That's his neo-Kantianism, his Weberianism. Nevertheless, he laments it in the manner of Weber, and sort of turns to the need for like public engagement. So
reading the second chapter of the sociological imagination, where he goes on and on, kind of recounting an approach to sociology, where
slamming Talcott Parsons.
Yeah, and you have to slog through these very dry attempts to define everything into the ground, and this unnatural approach to speak or to writing, where you state the obvious over and over again and make a complication out of something that is obvious and not complicated, and to find all the terms and break everything into more and more fine detail, and new terms are introduced, and
all the while giving the reader very little sense of exactly what the referent of what you're talking
like
about
it
is.
doesn't, it does, there's nothing, has, everything is completely abstract, and it's not grounded in any kind of human experience or real lived values. Values are used as a term of art, but you don't have any sense of what those values might be. And
right, value orientation.
I was reminded of some of the things that Hegel wrote at the beginning of The Science of Logic as to what's happened to logic without any kind of ontological or metaphysic grounding it. Like there's just this sort of game with axioms and almost purely quantitative kind of approach to reason and rationality that he's trying to overcome in The Science of Logic. And so it's interesting to see that repetition in a book about sociology, which you wouldn't really expect this. I didn't really expect to see that there, but it did come to mind when I was reading that section.
I mean, yeah. So the two chapters that follow the very famous introduction. Again, like tens of thousands of students are asked to read that. Have been asked to read the introduction to this book in intro to sociology classes in the last half century. It's extremely famous. But then he goes on to, as you say, to this critique of grand theory and what he calls abstracted empiricism,
right,
in chapter 3. And it's a good way of thinking about it in the sense that it looks like you're dealing with a dialectical critique. Right, of these antinomies, right? There's grand theory on the one hand, and then there's kind of methodologically obsessed, like survey research obsessed. The figure would be a guy named like Paul Lazarsfeld, who was one of his colleagues at Columbia. That chapter didn't make him any friends at Columbia. And so the one is all about like, Lazarsfeld does like big, like, sort of groundbreaking or pioneering research into elections and voting patterns, and really helps to inaugurate the whole industry that we now have of political bean counting. And so you think it's dialectical in the manner of like an Adorno or Horkheimer. Whom C. Wright Mills knows, right, and admires.
Has he met them, or has he just read them? Do you think had he met Horkheimer and Adorno in his lifetime?
He writes to Horkheimer, we know, because he wants to go. He wants an appointment in Frankfurt at the Frankfurt School, at the Institute in Frankfurt, and he knows Leo Löwenthal, who had been very much in the inner circle of the Frankfurt School in the 30s and 40s. He's friends with him, and so I think the real question is whether he knew Marcuse. Marcuse's in the United States. I don't know that he ever met Horkheimer and Adorno, but Marcuse refers to him as a kind of comrade in arms, as an inspiration, really because of his book called The Power Elite, which Marcuse engages in, I believe, One-Dimensional Man. So he's definitely, like, they definitely know of each other. Whether Horkheimer and Adorno are particularly aware, I can't say. To the extent that they are connected to his world, they are connected to people that Mills hates. So Adorno worked with Paul Lazarsfeld, the guy who Mills views as typifying abstracted empiricism, and a man named Daniel Bell, who's another famous 20th century sociologist, was a research assistant to Horkheimer and Pollock and Adorno when they were basically attached to Columbia. We also know that at the end of the day, Mills is a pragmatist. He is
an American pragmatist.
He's an American pragmatist. So what looks like, if you're, as you and I might be, like too far, down the Marxist rabbit hole, right? When you start reading this book, you're like, oh, this is going to be like a dialectical critique of sociology in the mid 20th century, in the manner that like Adorno will stage like a dialectical critique of like Weber and Durkheim as typifying sort of an antinomy within sociology. In, for instance, the essay called Sociology by Adorno. But it's not that, right? What it is saying like, look, neither this nor that, but this kind of combination of the best of both worlds. Right. And so it's really about, how to do sociology properly. And that involves, for instance, a major critique of the ahistorical character of both grand theory and abstracted empiricism. And it's great as far as it goes, but really for him, Horkheimer and Adorno are just great social theorists that he would assimilate to Weber and Veblen and Mannheim and the rest of his sort of canon of heroes. He refers people to it, in print. He says, the Journal of the Frankfurt School in the 1930s, when they published in both German and then later in English in New York, it's the greatest publication in the social sciences of our time. I mean, he really admires them, and he wants to go work with them. But, the one book that he certainly read that was written in English is a critique of pragmatism, right? Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason. And we know he didn't like it, right? He didn't like Horkheimer's. He did, it's not that he didn't like it. He disagreed, and it really, so it really, in that sense, as these things tend to do, especially as, you'll hear me explain it or Chris explain it, it comes down to the dialectic. It is a rejection of the dialectic in Mills, in favor of a kind of fusion of neo-Kantianism and pragmatism. I mean, really, pragmatism is a kind of an American neo-Kantianism.
Yeah, that book, The Eclipse of Reason, is one I really admire, and I return to, certain sections of it to just throw into videos and things. And
it's great.
Yeah, and I guess it is a critique of pragmatism, but to me it reads like just a critique of society or of our contemporary politics, including most of the left. I think of The Eclipse of Reason as being very applicable to the way we debate the news today, and so the way we operate on the surface.
To liberalism, right? I mean, it's obviously John Dewey is, he's a great American philosopher. I mean, I first had C. Wright Mills put in my hand by Richard Rorty, the great pragmatist of the end of the 20th century, who also taught me Dewey.
I guess what I want to say is like,
so like this is American thought, like.
But Horkheimer is not deal. Like the Horkheimer's book, The Eclipse of Reason, is not just having a debate with the ideas of American pragmatists. He is describing the material and political history that has led to this moment of pragmatism dominating. And it's that description of why, which we have this ideology that moves me, is not so much the sitting around arguing point by point with the poverty of the pragmatist philosophy, but
Sure.
the description of
That's because American pragmatism is really the high intellectual expression of progressivism. And progressivism shapes our politics and our social life in fundamental ways in the United States. Only Americans call progressivism liberalism.
Right.
Right. And that's, in a sense, because of the success of a figure like John Dewey in saying progressivism is the Enlightenment carried forward in in essentially the post-Darwinian age in the late 19th and 20th century. And so, William James and Dewey, these are there's, in other words, in an American voice, they're saying we are American revolutionaries. Right. We are. This is the intellectual continuity with the thought of the founding fathers. Right. Of course, with the thought of the Republican, the Republican Party, of the Civil War, of Abraham Lincoln, et cetera. Right. They're claiming that whole history for themselves. Of course they are, and that's why Horkheimer takes it as the object of his critique. Right. Because it is the whole question of the late American Revolution, or the American Revolution in the age of imperialism, right? And really whether liberalism can be so complacently advanced, so that's what Dewey and James represent, right? These are, of course, major figures that that young Americans make a huge mistake to ignore, just like they make a huge mistake ignoring the American intellectual tradition generally, right? You and I were the first generation that was sort of, told to read everything in translation, from French and German, and that's a mistake. That's a kind of, an unfortunate symptom of left academia, in its kind of postmodernized phase.
Right. I never read Dewey for class or on my own. Right. I'm aware of Dewey. I know this. It's the same guy that did the decimal system, right? Am I wrong there?
But you went to school in America, and John Dewey
right.
is the great
right.
philosopher of public schools, right?
Right. I know exactly. So. Yeah, no, I know of Dewey, but I've not read him. So, and I know of pragmatism, but only in so much as to dismiss it, right? But the difficulty there is you end up a pragmatist by default in a way, but if you don't engage with the ideas, I think. Anyway.
Well, the left becomes, obviously the left becomes progressives by default. I mean, we see that all the time. And, what that would have looked like for someone like C. Wright Mills is he would have been very aware of a figure like Sidney Hook, who had been an American Marxist intellectual in New York City, who abandons Marxism in favor of pragmatism. And he would have been aware of the Dewey Commission, right, where John Dewey headed up a commission to, in a sense, conduct the trial of Leon Trotsky. Right, to take up the charges issued by the Soviet Union against Trotsky, and they went down and met with Trotsky and collected evidence. And there's a whole fat book published by John Dewey called "The Case of Leon Trotsky," where Dewey and these other sort of legally minded intellectuals say these show trial charges are outrageous. So that the Trotskyists got this American liberal to do this, right? And so all of the there's a very deep engagement in general in New York City at this time, especially in New York City, about the legacy of what does that mean in the 1930s? It means the New Deal. right? These American pragmatists are staffing the New Deal. These progressives, these liberals, these Deweyians are staffing the New Deal. And of course, after the Popular Front, so are the communists, right? And that's where this, where Mills is like engaging these Trotskyists, right, who are resisting that, right, resisting the kind of alliance of the progressives and the American Communist Party. And so, on the one hand, he's engaging Shachtman, he's engaging Dwight McDonald, who was editing a journal called Politics that Mills wrote for in the 40s. And on the other hand, he's trying to, but he's taking pragmatism in another direction, right? Rather than simply, viewing it in terms of the prevailing liberalism, he's trying to say, no, it's really a route back into the questions of freedom and reason, which are opposed to this administered world, right? So he has a very kind of Frankfurt School account of what the world after the war looks like, right? It's a one-dimensional society. It's what he calls a world of cheerful robots, right? It's a world of people, of rule followers, of people who can no longer, it's a world of what the 50s would have called alienation. This kind of, which he attributes to Marx, but really isn't what Marx means by that category at all. So it's this, he has this critique that we're living in a world where freedom and reason are like exhausted in favor of this bureaucratized, formally rationalized world, right? And he thinks that of kind of pragmatic appropriation of sociology will give us a model for a new kind of intellectualism that he calls he's the person who coins the phrase public intellectual, right? And he's really talking about that at the end of the book. It's very tricky because it's a very liberal idea, right? You're going to write books and you're going to influence the world by influencing public opinion. So it's he's a figure of high distress, I would say, intellectually.
I want to show, after I read the intro, a movie clip came to mind. And I want to run this movie clip for you and just see what your reaction is to it. It's a kind of cynical, I have to admit, thought that I had when I was reading the intro. Here it is. Yeah. I'll put it on the screen.
Oh. Yeah, I'm here, man. The lights are growing dim. I know a life of crime led me to this sorry fate. And yet, I blame society. Society made me what I am.
Bullshit. You're a white suburban punk, just like me.
But it still hurts.
So tell me what about the first chapter reminded you of this?
Well, just he's going through how all of the problems that people face in their private lives can't really be solved on the level of their private individual agency. But in fact, you have to look at it in terms of the total structure of society, and each person is put into these positions where there are bad outcomes based on that structure. And so we have to think on the sociological level and having a sociological imagination in order to overcome these problems. And, on the face of it, that's fine. But on the other hand, it seems to me like that sociological imagination is turned into progressivist policies to, overcome social ills.
Absolve the criminals of guilt.
Yes, right. Absolve everyone of having to take some responsibility for their lives and the future, and instead have the people come in and modify the structure of society. The smart intellectuals will come in and fix it for us, so that the maze that we're in, this rat cage, will be adjusted so that the better outcomes occur. So that's
right.
That's what
I mean, you could see that opening chapter as like posing a question of like structure and agency, right? Like, what kind of agency does the individual have, right? What he calls biography, in relation to society as a whole, which is a limited question, right? But it's better than what some of these millennials are concerned with, which is like, free will. I mean,
right.
It's a much higher posing of the question than that.
Right. True.
But it's a very it's a liberal recognition turned into a problem, right? So for like Adam Smith, there's a virtuous complementarity between the freedom of the individual and the freedom of society as a whole, right? They're not counterposed to one another, right? In the 20th century, assimilating to society, becoming a productive member of society, seems to be possible only at the price of your individuality, right? So this is the concern of like the beat poets, or James Dean, like Rebels Without a Cause, right? This is the world of C. Wright Mills, right? Early rock and roll, jazz, right? I think Miles Davis's Kind of Blue comes out the same year as the Sociological Imagination, right? Concerns with like free improvisation, right, of the individual within the group, right, that you see in like jazz criticism, and of course Adorno's critique of jazz criticism, of this kind of self-understanding of jazz, that fails to account for what Lenin would call the spontaneity of spontaneity. In other words, the way that even what looks like spontaneous freedom in society is itself conditioned. So I think that it's a super valuable book, and Mills is interesting, and but really when we're looking at it from the point of view of 2025, I mean, no doubt. I'm sorry, 2026. No doubt a young person, just like an 18-year-old, is just going to learn a lot from reading these books. But from the point of view of a leftist in crisis like us, right, what it really involves is a confrontation with the legacy of the New Left and the post-war world, or really the 20th century. C. Wright Mills is a towering intellectual of the 20th century, and therefore grappling with him might help us to, at some level, in some way, get a handle on the way in which we seem condemned to repeat the 20th century, and that in doing so less and less, as it were, consciously. So obviously, these millennials are just interested in like repeating the New Left, right? They'll just, they just want to be G.A. Cohen in terms of understanding Marx, or Louis Althusser, or they're all Lacanians, right? They're all there's a way in which there's no transcending this right era, even as, of course, if you talk to them, right, they all dismiss the new left, and the new left is stupid, and the new left is just about culture, or the new left is hippies or something like that. They don't really think of the crisis of leftism per se, right? Not like one strain of this 50s and 60s left that they can easily dismiss, but rather the whole legacy of the crisis of the left. Right.
Yeah.
And that's because they want to think communism just goes on. It just carries on. The left carries on. The left has not gone through a crisis. Well, that's why they don't have an epochal sensibility, which at least Mills has.
That brings me to another question that I had written down in advance. Wouldn't it be fair to say that Mills was working during a time of unrest and splitting within the socialist nations and broader international socialist movement, and that he should be thought of and as a figure of that crisis, rather than just as a liberal pragmatist, like that he is in some ways a symptom of the new left, which was a left that came out of the attempted revolutionary movements within socialism against the Soviet empire. So
the big events that would have shaped, obviously he's writing from the middle of World War II on.
Right.
But his two great books are from 1956 and from 1959. The Power Elite and the Sociological Imagination. And then there are important other writings that are all from the late 50s and early 60s, including the Letter to the New Left that you have already referred to. And so he's a figure of the new left. I mean, these cultural shifts that I was already talking about are the ambient expression of a much, so like whatever, jazz, rock and roll, the beats are cultural expressions of deep historical transformation that really are given expression at the level of politics and world history by the uprising in Hungary in 1956, which is what you're referencing in terms of like revolts against the Eastern Bloc communism. Khrushchev's 20th Party Congress speech condemning the cult of personality of Joseph Stalin, and in opening the question of the possibility of the critique of communism within communism. And perhaps most importantly, though the left doesn't acknowledge it, the civil rights movement in the United States, right? Which is not just about ending Jim Crow, right? Of course it's about that, but it's really about the crisis of the New Deal coalition, right? At the heart of which were the Dixiecrats, right? The solid South that supported FDR and Truman, and in that sense, the Kennedy, for that matter. The New Deal coalition is cracking up in the late 50s under the pressure of its great, obviously, contradiction, which is the contradiction between the Democrats being the party of the labor movement and the Democrats being the party of American apartheid. And so the labor movement is starting to fund the civil rights movement, right? And train civil rights workers like Rosa Parks, and via Miles Horton and all of that, the larger SNCC core SCLC body of cadre of the civil rights movement. And now by like 59, 60, the white students of the North are beginning to get involved, right?
Mhm.
It's inspired by their uh, their black age cohort classmate in the sit-ins, right? So you get the sit-in movement in like 1960. So that's
I
all
think of
happened.
I think of the free speech movement that came up in '63 as coming right out of the civil rights movement. And
Right. The larger point being that this is the early New Left, and in some ways the more interesting New Left, right? The more interesting period, the period of great possibility, very arguably, is from 1956 to 1965.
Mhm.
You know, before the great issue becomes Vietnam,
Right.
which is a way for the American New Left, but not only the American New Left, to evade the task of reconstituting, of building a new left in their own country, right? The project of the new left is one of creating a new left, right? It's not creating a new sensibility or just overcoming racism or inventing feminism or academic
Stopping the
leftism.
war or
Stopping the war. It's not those things. It's about creating a new party for socialism in the United States, right? At its most cogent and thoroughgoing.
And I want to
Right.
point out that idea of starting a new party.
And I just want to point out that the crisis of the Democrats, it's not about taking over the Democrats. It's about what the crisis of the Democrats opens up in terms of the possibilities of a new socialist party.
Right. But I just think that today, for most younger leftists, and hell, 20 years ago from me, like during, or 25 years ago, I guess, during the beginning of the war on terror, if you had said to me, "Oh no, the task for the left is not to stop the war, but to build itself and to build a party," I would have said that's deflationary. I would have said, we are faced with a horrible crisis. There are people starving to death in Afghanistan because of the bombing campaign. And to say, oh, what we should do is file some forms and create yet another of these little pretend parties and what do you want me to do? Join the Greens or make another Green Party, or what are you talking about? But I think in 1960, with the letter to the New Left, there is a sense that a new political party might be possible in that letter, even though it's not.
He's certainly aware of a widespread discontent amongst intellectuals.
Right.
That he addresses directly. Right. And obviously he sees, he feels the comradeship with the people who are editing the New Left Review in Great Britain. People like E.P. Thompson. This is before Perry Anderson takes over. And he's a classic thinker of, he criticizes the labor metaphysic, right? He says, basically, the labor metaphysic is like workerist Marxism, right? Which he calls Victorian, right? And yet, and instead, he's interested in this diffuse discontent, which he sees the intellectuals registering, but in, of course, society at large. And he does refer to the civil rights movement, very, very briefly in the letter to the New Left. And which, of course, would have been a major part of that discontent in the United States, especially it's what young people would have, what young people were attracted to, right? They did build the New Left in solidarity with the civil rights movement. That's what the original occasion really was. So someone like Tom Hayden, who I referred to earlier, right, who wrote the Port Huron Statement, he was already going down south and involved in organizing in like 1960. So you get this preoccupation with like new social forces, right? The working class. Right? So he says, like, look, we can't be like these old labor politicians or these old communists, like preoccupied with the working class as the sole lever of change. So it's a critique of like workerism, whether in its social democratic or in its Stalinist form.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Even as he says, we have to re-engage Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's the most interesting part of that letter. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Where he's like, well, you got to read Marx and Lenin and Leaves of Luxembourg. What you're
Mhm.
supposed to get out of that is really unclear, but clearly he does think there's something to get out of it other than what he calls the labor metaphysic.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Maybe something like what Moishe Postone would argue for, is what he
well, Moishe is definitely a reader of C. Wright Mills, right?
Right.
His Marxism is a critique of what he would call the critique of capitalism from the point of view of labor.
Right.
Right. Which he would view as labor metaphysic Marxism. Right. There's a lot of commonalities between, Moishe would have viewed the post-war world as a new environment, right? He did view it that way, right? And he viewed historic socialism as exhausted, right? And in some sense, merely the inheritor of liberalism, right? So, for instance, Moishe refers to the Bolshevik Revolution as a capital constituting revolution, right? It's like it's building bourgeois society. It's not overcoming bourgeois society, right? So it's a counterposing of these two things, right? It's a counterposing of bourgeois revolution to socialism or whatever Marx was talking about, right? And that's a kind of a broad, inheritance that, of course, you see all the time with young people today, right? They have no understanding of the relationship of Marxism to liberalism. This is why they can't grasp the bourgeois revolution that's happening all around them.
Right.
Like Trump is a bourgeois revolution. Sanders is a bourgeois revolution. Right? What we're going through is a bourgeois revolution without socialist leadership. That's what that's what's happening. And socialism is going to emerge by taking up all of the liberal discontent in society. Right? It's going to emerge by taking up, discontent with, whatever censorship of our tweets or, a regimented curriculum in the university. Whatever Mario Savio said, right? We're not going to be, bits of the, cogs in the machine.
Right. There's comes a time when you can't take part, when you can't even passively take part. You have to put your bodies against the levers and against the wheels. You have to say to the machine and the people who run it that it's time for it to stop, something like that.
Right, which is a liberal demand for liberal education, right?
Right.
Which is fine. Right? There's you have to, it's a high articulation of that. But to go back to your point about like if what you thought about like in the anti-war movement, right? If someone had said, well, the point of the anti-war movement is to build socialism, right?
I would have been okay with that. I would have been okay with that. But I would have said, we have to stop the war, and that will help us build socialism. We have to rein in the military-industrial complex and U.S. imperialism to make room for a socialist movement. Something like that. That's what I did say at protests in 2001 and 2002 and 2003.
It's very tricky, right? Because the anti-war movement, BLM today, the struggle against ICE, like all of these things make a certain sense. And at the same time, taking part in them means tailing capitalist politics.
Right. Well, what I
because capitalist politics will demand the end of the war, right?
Yeah. Well, what I recognized in 2003 was that the peace movement was already almost from the start co-opted by the Democratic Party. And what bothered me about it was not so much as that we were going to get Democrats elected or that we were being recuperated into capitalist politics, but that the Democrats didn't mean it. The Democrats that were, recuperating our movement weren't going to stop the war. They were simply using us.
You were a discontented Democrat.
Yeah, right. I was. Yeah.
Right. I mean, what I would say is that, there's really no sense in which anything's being co-opted. Right.
Right.
Because there's simply no socialist politics. And so what else is politics going to be but capitalist? Right. And that's obviously a very hard pill to swallow. But it, from especially a Marxist point of view, all of it is a means to an end.
Right. I mean,
nothing.
When
socialism is not a goal, right? Workers' power is not the goal. The goal is the world beyond the working class, right?
Right. Yeah. I just want to say, when I go back 25 years, 24 years to remember myself as a leftist in the traditional way back then, I really am, in a way, channeling young millennials today, because I don't think I was very different from how they are now back then. And also, it seems pretty close to me. The 24-year time gone by pretty quick, but no doubt. But I have changed my mind about these things in the interim. And if I could go back, I would behave, I think, differently than I did. I don't know to what effect. I
mean, obviously, we have to make a virtue of experience, right? And it's a sadly devalued commodity in this world, right? Where everyone thinks that the youth represent the future, and the youth are they're not assimilated fully into society. They haven't betrayed themselves. All this fetishism of youth, but we have to say no. Look, we already saw, because what were we doing in the 1990s and early 2000s, but pretty much self-consciously carrying on the legacy of the 60s and 70s.
Oh yeah, totally self-consciously. Yeah. I was reading about May 1968, pining for it, all that kind of stuff.
Right. And that experience is worthwhile because, it was, of course, extremely important to see the millennials reject that, right? To reject just sort of the struggle continues, to reject in that sense the 80s and 90s left, the kind of post-political left. At the same time, this is exactly what they're forgetting now, right? What they're forgetting now is you felt the need to try to reckon with the legacy of the 20th century.
Right. Yeah. While we were talking, forgive me for this, maybe this is a little self-indulgent, but while we're talking about C. Wright Mills and the letter from the New Left, and the way he turns towards intellectuals as the group that should be organized for political change rather than workers, I recalled having read about and written about a number of times about our generation, about Generation X, about the term Generation X. And what's interesting, what I really found interesting looking into it a little bit, was that it was a term that actually was used to describe not our generation, not baby boomers, but the silent generation, the generation that were kids during World War II. And they were written about because of their dissatisfaction with and alienation from their society after the trauma of living through the war. But also through that repetition of the term Generation X, it also became synonymous with the idea that there was a class of creatives and intellectuals, young people, that would be agents for massive social change. And that was what Generation X was basically the youthful intellectuals who were coming up to change society. So our whole generation was named in a sense as the revolutionary class of C. Wright Mills. You know,
I mean, a couple of things. I mean, I would say that, first of all, we're talking about 1959 and the publication of the Sociological Imagination. Of course, this is the coming of age of the silent generation.
right.
Right. And, what I'm saying when I'm saying that the new left isn't just a story of, the opposition to the Vietnam War in 1968 in Paris and Chicago and whatever, is that it's not just a story about the boomers.
Right.
It's a story about the silent generation. My mom and dad went to college in 58, 59. They were born in 40, 41. And there would have, that generation is coming of age, and they're, the past is gone, right? Obviously, like what people have to see, and you will get a sense of this from Mills, and that's what I'm trying to say about it. There is just a massive hole at the heart of Mills, and that hole is the death of socialism. Right? It really is, and that's what his thinking. He thinks of Marxism as the thinking of class struggle, of like a proletarian form of thought that that's preoccupied primarily with class, and in that sense, it's a labor metaphysic, and that's what he rejects. But he's also concerned with what's the new revolutionary subject, right? What all of these people are thinking about. And since the collapse of socialism, one of the primary indices of the crisis of society has been educated people. Right? It's not to say that there isn't widespread discontent amongst working people, or even the semi-employed, lumpenized population. There is, but for the most part, that takes a non-political form. It takes the form of crime and other social pathologies. The morbid symptoms of capitalism that are
sometimes they form punk bands, and
sure,
or rap groups or what have you, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they but even then it can be cultural at the level of fashion. Obviously, the working class, the urban working class, especially the Black urban working class, has led fashion for a long time. But in terms of any kind of awareness of the question of the historical crisis. Obviously, you get now 4 generations, right? The silent generation, the boomers, us, and the millennials. Really 5 now with Gen Z as young intellectuals, that do grapple with this stuff, right? And what's important about looking at the New Left is that it was the most authentic and highest form of trying to overcome the crisis of the collapse of Marxism, right? And that's where Mills is interesting. He is trying to say, is there a new project, or do we need to renew Marxism or somehow renew liberalism? I mean, he's really quite an open-ended thinker, quite an honest thinker, and in that sense, a kind of charming thinker. Even if we can say, he's a pragmatist, or he's a progressive, or he's a left Weberian, or whatever. Those things are also true. But he like so many other figures from that generation, Marcuse, Frantz Fanon. I mean, these are the giants of the 50s and the 60s, right? Fanon writes The Wretched of the Earth around the time that C. Wright Mills dies. He dies around the same time that C. Wright Mills dies. Very much the same generation. These figures who the New Left looked to, their teachers, but also, all of the Trotskyist sects, right, that had a new opportunity after 1956, right? If there was ever going to be an opportunity for Trotskyism, it was the New Left, right? If it was, if it was ever going to actually prosecute, the critique of Stalinism in a way as to open up, some kind of scope for a renewed Marxism, a recovery of revolutionary Marxism. It was in the New Left. And that's why, all of our interpretations of Marx, come from that period, right? That's why, Ben Burgess follows Jerry Cohen, and that's why, Conrad Hamilton will follow, or Daniel Tutt will follow Althusser, because their experience was deeper, right? Obviously. And, what I would argue is it becomes an obstacle, right? And you have to, in a sense, reckon with the New Left in order to set it aside, because ultimately the New Left is a monumental lie, right? Because the way that we inherit it and the way that subsequent generations are inheriting it is progressive bullshit, right? The idea that there was a project of a new socialism is never mentioned, right? And instead you're told about how heroic they were and how they overcome racism, and how they overcame racism, and how they overcame sexism, and how they changed the world, and young people, suck in comparison. And, it's, Angela Davis is like the real revolutionary, right? And the more black, and the late form of the New Left is the really radical one, the black nationalist form. Right. And all of this bullshit, right? And they never tell you, well, the fundamental project failed, right? That's a really important thing to understand with respect to all of it, right? With respect to the whole neo-Marxism of the 60s and 70s. My shelf is full of books from that period. Right. All the stuff that we talked about at the beginning, Lukács, Korsch, this stuff was all translated into English in the 60s and 70s, right? The Frankfurt School, C. Wright Mills could read the Frankfurt School, what they wrote in English, or what he could puzzle through with his German. But it wasn't like you had the works of Horkheimer and Adorno at your fingertips the way we do, right? We have all of this stuff, and it comes to us from the New Left, from those intellectuals.
But I want to play it.
Kind of Moise Stone. It's these people are a failure, right? And the good ones tell you so.
Right. I want to play a clip from 5 years ago now, if you can believe it, that will sum up where it all landed, where the New Left went to eventually. And here it is.
Unbelievable.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I got to beware. Think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right, everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their mind, getting so much resistance From behind, we gotta stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. What a feeling for the heat. 1,000 people in the street.
All right, I can't take any more of that. I have to, I have to stop. But there it is. You remember that? Can you believe it's 5 years ago now that we had to suffer through that? But
I feel like there were other ones from like BLM, right? I mean, it obviously the endless recycling of this stuff, right?
right, yeah, yeah.
Never
but
mind
this
that the
was,
song itself is like anti-political, right?
Yeah,
Young people
right.
like singing songs and carrying signs, mostly say "Hooray for our side." Right? It's just
right,
it's just a petty bourgeois rejection of politics.
Right.
Is actually at the heart of the song.
right, yeah. But it's thought of as a great anti-war anthem. But it was actually not even about the war. It was about some riot outside of a club or something. But anyhow, yeah, it's amazing where everything ended up. And in 2020, boy, did it feel discouraging to see the regurgitation of the culture of what I thought of as the left when I was a kid in the 90s, just being used for the Democrats so explicitly. Because this was to bring in Biden.
I mean, for Christ's sake, we're living in an age where the Democrats are socialists, Doug. Right? I mean,
right.
Where they won't say otherwise, right?
Right.
It's not just that they're accused of it, right?
Right.
They we're supposed to believe that Bernie Sanders and AOC are socialists, right? It's unbelievable. Right? People have no idea. I mean, they have no idea what socialism was, right? I mean, I was listening to a podcast of Brianna Joy Gray and Gabriel Rockhill, and they're just like, well, they're just like preoccupied with like electoralism and the same shit from the Sanders campaign.
Listen,
Right.
This is where we break and we go to the parrot room where we can just bitch for a little while about what's actually happening now. But this is a great episode, and thank you very much for coming by again. And we'll do it again soon, in a couple of weeks maybe.
Cool.
So,
Sounds good.
I'm going to
Thanks,
end it
Doug.
there. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.